Hey everyone, so Avish here, wanted to discuss this paper that we had sent off to AI and ethics and that we recently got reviews back for, talk you through that whole review process, my initial responses to the reviews, my responses after discussing it with my collaborator Cosmin, and how we're going to respond to them, and generally talk about why we wrote this paper in the first place. So this paper is trying to bridge two different areas, interpretability and AI ethics. Interpretability is basically an AI field. It's a technical field of how we understand AI systems. AI ethics is more of a philosophical field where you're looking at, can AI systems, AI models really have any concept of morality? And so we wrote this as a perspective paper, which is basically a very opinionated review paper. There are three key concepts to the work that we're doing here. The first is interpretable machine learning. It can be split very crudely into two different areas, black box reasoning and white box reasoning. Black boxes are where you get an input, it goes through some process and you get the output. You don't fully understand what that process is. And so the way that you understand these decisions is post hoc. Based on the output, based on what we know about how the model is, what the model is, can we figure out how that output came about? Then white box models, on the other hand, have a more transparent reasoning process. Still doesn't mean that we can understand them as humans, but it means that they're more clear as to why they made a decision than a black box model. A big aspect there is like you can break down the reasoning steps of an AI model with different granularity. So for example, algorithmic transparency looks at general constraints, algorithmic constraints or like limits of the behavior, or it looks at the actual training process itself. Then you have concepts like decomposability and simulatability, which look at each individual step of the algorithm. Do we have a human intuitive explanation for that? And so we use these concepts to frame our arguments. We view interpretability for deployed AI systems, so AI systems in the real world, as almost a debugging tool. So that's basically if a model is doing well or it's doing badly, that you can give it some sort of error correction, you can give it some feedback in order to make sure that it does better in the future. And so we view that understanding as a debugging tool. How well do you need to understand the model in order to improve its behavior? The second concept is looking at artificial moral agents. So this is a concept from the AI ethics literature, looking at different ways of instilling morality into your agent. Three major paradigms there: bottom up, top down, and hybrid. Bottom up is where you have some general sort of moral constraints, but within that, the agent can then go and explore more and kind of generalize a bit better to unseen environments. Top down is very strong constraints. So you imbue your agent with some very specific moral, philosophical paradigms. So that could be something like utilitarianism, virtue ethics, something like that. And then hybrid is where you combine the bottom up and top down approaches in some way. The third concept is how the capability of an artificial moral agent is altered by different levels of interpretability. So if we understand an artificial agent better, does it suddenly have more capability? What level of understanding do we need to have for it? And the whole point here is that we want to have AI systems in the world that fit with the values that we have as humans. With moral decision making, it's never going to be fully automated by AI agents, but it can be improved. It's good to have a higher average level or even a second opinion that could be enabled by having an AI agent involved in that decision-making process. And so what we're doing isn't trying to automate away humans. We're trying to help humans make better decisions. In order to do that, we think about what level of trust do we need to have in these artificial moral agents. And that's what our first argument is about. Section 3 of the paper looks at whether we can trust black box agents, whether we know if the black box agents have learned an appropriate set of moral principles. Then in section 4, we look at more how white box models are important for the end user. So we think about algorithmic transparency, how useful is that? Then we look at decomposability and how useful that is for the people involved in the decision-making process. The conclusion that we came up to here is one of common sense, really. It's that the more capable your agent, your AI model is, the more shit it can do. And so you basically need to understand it better in order to make sure that it's safe. Nothing that is rocket science, but it's nice to have a conclusion that I think is kind of common sense based off a lot of reasoning. And that's where I think this paper is nice, because it bridges two different fields, comes up with a sensible conclusion that is understandable to people who aren't necessarily from that field. And now with the input of the different reviewers, I think it's going to be even more accessible to people who aren't naturally from either of these fields. So going over my initial reactions to each reviewer, what reviewer one was asking for was a lot of definitions for each section just to make everything clearer. When I first read this, it was a bit annoying because it was like, I got a sense that this reviewer maybe wasn't familiar with interpretability or with AI ethics, and so really wanted clarity on each concept. And really, we had sort of described them already in different aspects, in different parts of the paper. But after chatting with Cosmin, I think, given the aims that we have of this paper of bridging two different fields, you're not just going to get people reading it who only know one of the fields. You're going to get people reading it who don't know either. And so being as clear as you possibly can in the background is so important for laying a good foundation for them to understand the arguments, the reasoning that you have in future sections. And so ultimately, I think it was actually quite helpful to have this person look at the paper. It made us think as well, maybe we could be clearer with more images, more diagrams, and ultimately has led to us building what I think is a more accessible paper to people of any background. The second review was a bit more frustrating. We wrote a sentence that says something along the lines of, we have discussed this concept, and we gave a reference example. What we should have said is, we have discussed this in a previous section. What it came across as to this reviewer, and I think to us as well, rereading this, is that we were referencing a paper that we ourselves had written. And the way that reviews work, you have to submit your paper as an anonymized document. And so this ruined that anonymization. And so this reviewer just didn't review the whole paper because of this, which is annoying. But also, there are certain standards that you need to uphold that we did uphold, but we could have been clearer about upholding. We should have just said something like, we have discussed this in a previous section. It is what it is. That happens. Final reviewer gave us something really insightful to think about, where it helps us define our scope more clearly. What they brought up was this point about moral agency. And we have talked about things that could justifiably convince us that an AI system is moral, but we haven't talked specifically about true moral agency. So some inherent capacity of what allows an agent to go and reason in new situations or whatever. What gives them that thing that is more similar to what humans have? There are a few different concepts for morality. So one is an idea of there's some notion of obligation, some responsibility. The other is about whether humans learn some moral capabilities throughout their lives. On the responsibility part, we'd had a sentence that said, we don't consider the case of sentient AI agents, so we don't have to deal with where the responsibility or obligation falls for them. But we hadn't fully talked about that learning process in AI agents. We briefly referred to it with humans, where we talked about, yes, humans seem to learn culturally some elements of morality throughout their life. We talked about how AI agents learn things sequentially through certain forms of interpretability and how we can understand that process. But we haven't talked step by step how they learn morality and then mapped that onto the human version of learning and figured out where those differences were. And I think in doing that, you can get a clearer idea of what it means to really learn some morality, some moral agency in a machine. This reviewer just brought that clearer to our perspective. And it was interesting because this reviewer said they'd come from a more philosophical background. What they were saying wasn't an issue they had with the paper per se, but more a concern, I think, regarding differing perspectives on how AI agents are viewed from a philosophical perspective versus ours, which is more of a technical one. What they said was basically, we should have a couple extra paragraphs just going through these differences between AI agents and human agents in more depth. Talk about that aspect of moral agency a bit more. And it helped us create a clearer scope for our paper, which again, I think ultimately created a more accessible paper for people who want to know more, learn more about this field. So all in all, I think it was a pretty positive review process. I mean, it took a while. It took a year, obviously, from when we submitted it, 13 months to be exact. But because it's taken so long, I've come back to this with a fresh pair of eyes and with more knowledge on interpretability, on artificial moral agents, that I think I can understand where the reviewers are coming from better. And then obviously having a really great collaborator and a friend now in Cosmin, who just is very precise, almost surgical with the way that he lays out arguments. As someone who doesn't really write essays that often, it's really useful to have him to bounce ideas off of. And I think he really is the one who managed to make this a lot more coherent and really have that story be as tight as it is throughout the paper. Cool, I think that's all I really needed to say on this. Peace.